Hello everyone, I'm Danny Roddy of DannyRoddy.com, and today I'm talking with Georgi, aka Haidut of RayPeteForum.com. Georgi is an independent health researcher and the owner of Idea Labs, a small company producing high-quality boutique supplements with the focus of supporting a healthy metabolism. Today, Georgi and I will discuss the youth-associated substances Pregnenolone, Progesterone, and DHEA, and their role in the chronic renewal of the organism. We'll also discuss how metabolic stress decreases the concentration of these steroids and how a deficiency leads to problems normally associated with aging. In addition to thanking Georgi for talking with me today, I'd like to thank my patrons for making this content possible and supporting all of the work that I do. And you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/DannyRoddy. Without further ado, here is the show. The main thing that I think is lost on a lot of people, and the connection isn't made, is that we briefly talked about energy metabolism last week, but what is constantly modifying energy metabolism are these hormones, and especially the youth-associated hormones, Pregnenolone, Progesterone, and DHEA.
That's correct, yes. So basically, the way these steroids are produced and why thyroid hormone is so important is because without proper mitochondrial function, the mitochondria can disintegrate and the cell will die. So if you're stuck in glycolysis, in other words, producing just enough energy for the cell to survive and divide, this will not be enough. There will be not enough ATP to synthesize any steroids. So this means glycolysis is not enough to support the steroid synthesis.
And this is a huge loaded question, but what is the difference between glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation or oxidative metabolism?
Well, basically, the glycolysis is just the first step where glycose is converted to pyruvate, and in the process, I think only 3 molecules of ATP are created. And if the entire pathway, the entire oxidative metabolism is executed, I think you end up with 32. So basically, it's really it's a way of producing energy that only primitive life forms do, and this shows you basically why cancer acts the way it does.
And this is weird to think about because in mainstream, we're beat over the head with the idea that cancer is a problem that nobody can understand. And when in reality, it's pretty detailed of how the cells are being diverted into this state by a deficiency of oxidative phosphorylation.
Yeah, and even Otto Warburg, who got the Nobel Prize for pretty much for his discoveries in relates to cancer, he said that anything that inhibits oxidative metabolism chronically will cause cancer. So in his mind, there was no doubt about that. I know he experimented mostly with toxic substances that were known to inhibit metabolism, but Hans Selye later showed that stress can do the same. So in other words, it's considered in some biochemical circles, it's considered a pretty common knowledge that if you stress the cell to a point where all it does is basically stays in a glycolytic state, eventually the cell will become cancerous. And a recent study just came out, was posted on Reddit, and of course it generated a lot of controversy. It showed that the so-called Warburg effect is not just an effect of cancer, but directly drives oncogenesis. In other words, it was directly carcinogenic as well.
How the cell is going to produce energy is influenced by these hormones, the so-called youth-associated hormones, Pregnenolone, Progesterone, and DHEA.
Yeah, that's correct. And first of all, they're an effect of proper oxidative metabolism, and also they themselves affect oxidative metabolism and push it in the direction towards oxidative phosphorylation and away from glycolysis. Basically, for the synthesis of these steroids, what you really need is, first of all, you need to have the cell needs to be properly energized. In other words, it needs to have proper oxidative metabolism. For that, thyroid hormone is paramount. Without that, you essentially guarantee that the cell will stay in a glycolytic state. In addition, so ATP basically is a cofactor for, you can say that it's a cofactor for the synthesis of steroids. And another cofactor is the molecule NAD, which stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It's a metabolite of niacinamide. If either ATP or NAD are low, in a sense, it's a signal for the cell that it's not energized enough, and it will not synthesize steroids. So those are two cofactors. Another one is vitamin A. and of course cholesterol, which is the precursor to all the steroids. And many people seem confused about why vitamin A is involved. And I've talked to Pete about it, and I've checked some studies on PubMed. But the bottom line is, it has been shown that without sufficient levels, two of the main enzymes that are in the steroid pathways, the enzyme called 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, which converts pregnenolone into progesterone, and also DHEA into androstenedione, and also the enzyme 17-alpha hydroxylase, which converts pregnenolone into DHEA. So without sufficient levels of vitamin A, these two enzymes will not function properly. So you'll basically be stuck at the cholesterol step.
Vitamin A, LDL cholesterol, active thyroid hormone, and then you said NAD, which is a product of oxidative phosphorylation or oxidative metabolism.
That's correct. Yeah, these are, in my opinion, these are the four main factors that influence steroid metabolism.
And then that once again brings the importance of mitochondrial health, because these steroids are produced in the mitochondria. And as you mentioned, if mitochondria is damaged, they can't be produced.
That's right. Basically, the first step of the process is cholesterol is transported into the cell, and inside the mitochondria, a molecule is removed from cholesterol by the cleavage enzyme, also known as desmolase, that is converted cholesterol into pregnenolone, and it happens inside the mitochondria. So just like we said, without properly functioning mitochondria, this step will not happen, and cholesterol will accumulate, which is something we'll talk about later. So then pregnenolone is released into the bloodstream and is carried into all the other tissues that need it. For example, the brain synthesizes a lot of pregnenolone itself, and actually brain levels of pregnenolone are about 100 times higher than they are in the blood, and about 30 to 50 times higher in the other tissues compared to the blood. So after pregnenolone is transported to these peripheral tissues, so to speak, then there is a whole bunch of enzymes that are responsible for the conversion of pregnenolone into all the other steroids. I mentioned the two main ones. The enzyme 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase is responsible for converting pregnenolone into progesterone, and also, which is one of the pathways, sort of the progesterone pathway from pregnenolone. And then the enzyme 17-alpha hydroxylase converts pregnenolone into DHEA. So DHEA is the precursor of all the androgens and estrogens, and progesterone is the precursor to the mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, to the corticoids like cortisol and cortisone. And actually, progesterone can actually also be a precursor to the androgens as well, which most people are surprised when they hear about it, but it actually can serve as a precursor to testosterone and even dihydrotestosterone, even though public opinion is that progesterone is actually an inhibitor of the androgens, but it can serve as a precursor for them as well. After cholesterol is metabolized into pregnenolone goes into the two main pathways. One of them is DHEA, the other one is progesterone, and then the peripheral tissues synthesize whatever endpoint hormones they need.
And it's commonly said that pregnenolone is like a precursor hormone, and then it's produced into whatever it's needed, as you said.
Yeah, that's correct. However, as Ray said, and as mainstream medicine has realized recently, pregnenolone has activities of its own. For a long time, it was considered inactive. And by a long time, I mean in the period between the 1960s and I would say early 2000s, mainstream medicine sort of lost interest in pregnenolone because it was considered as an inactive precursor steroid, almost like cholesterol. It didn't really have any activity on its own. But if you look at older studies, like between 1910 and 1940, you will see that pregnenolone was successfully used for the treatment of a variety of inflammatory conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, which is an autoimmune condition, and even multiple sclerosis, which at the time wasn't known as such. It was called a chronic demyelinating neurodegenerative condition. So there was a lot of interest in pregnenolone originally in the early 20th century, and then sort of interest waned as more powerful steroids were discovered, derivatives of pregnenolone such as dexamethasone, which is a synthetic corticoid, hydrocortisone, which is still currently used in clinical practice. In other words, modern medicine decided that more powerful steroids are better than pregnenolone, and sort of lost interest in it. But this has been revived in the last 10 years.
There's a large group of people that think that they have made something up called pregnenolone steel, and they think that pregnenolone can be made into cortisol. Do you think that is possible?
I would say that theoretically it's possible if you look at the steroid pathways. But if you look at some studies with humans, I believe that the only conditions where this has been shown to happen, and not from pregnenolone as a source material, but only from progesterone, the only condition where this has been shown definitively to happen is Cushing syndrome or Cushing disease. which is a pathological condition with an excess production of cortisol. Now, unless you have that, and that is a very rare condition, it's the incidence is about 1 to 2 per million people. Unless you have that, I don't believe that the term pregnenolone steal has been observed in practice. In other words, if you have it, and if you have confirmed you have it, you probably have other more serious conditions to worry about.
And then typically these hormones play a balance with the variety of stress hormones. So like cortisol, aldosterone, estrogen, prolactin. So what happens if you were to come under a pretty serious stress in a single day? What would happen to your production, or what should happen to your production of the youth associated hormones? And what typically happens as a person ages and they lose the capacity to produce these hormones?
So chronic stress leads to the activation of the so-called FFA axis. In other words, the hypothalamus adrenal axis. And it can be activated by a variety of things, such as external events, stressful events, infection, toxins, inflammation, assaults like radiation, ionizing radiation, and electromagnetic radiation as well. And this basically tells the hypothalamus to produce something called the corticotropin releasing hormone, which signals the pituitary to produce the so-called adrenocorticotropin hormone, ACTH, and on its own tells the adrenals to produce cortisol and adrenaline. Now, if this state is chronic, chronic elevated cortisol will lead to loss of muscle tissue, so that the muscle can be converted to glucose through the gluconeogenesis process in the liver. Cortisol also directly kills brain cells, and it has been implicated in many neurodegenerative conditions, as well as mood disorders such as depression and even schizophrenia. Cortisol also directly kills the thymus gland, which is the primary determinant of an organism's immunity. In addition, adrenaline leads to lipolysis, and this elevates the free fatty acids in the bloodstream, which has been shown to cause insulin resistance due to the Rendell cycle. But even more importantly, lately has been discovered that free fatty acids directly inhibit insulin signaling. So in other words, free fatty acids act almost like an insulin antagonist, and it makes you insulin resistant and ultimately probably diabetic. So this inhibition of insulin sensitivity is actually especially pronounced if the free fatty acids in your blood are PUFA, which we talked about last time. And PUFA is also the main precursor to the inflammatory mediators, and the inflammation is one of the biggest factors in reduced insulin sensitivity. And also it leads to the chronic overexpression of the enzyme aromatase, especially in fat tissue. And aromatase is the enzyme that converts the androgens such as testosterone and androstenedione. It converts them into the various estrogens such as estrone, estradiol, and estriol. So this means that somebody under chronic stress, for them the testosterone levels will drop and estrogen will rise. In addition, high cortisol inhibits the conversion of the hormone T4 into the active thyroid hormone T3, which happens in the liver, which ultimately means lower oxidative metabolism, which also means even further lowering of the steroid synthesis, with the exception of cortisol and estrogen, which stay high. Estrogen itself stimulates more cortisol production, so it becomes a vicious circle. Cortisol and estrogen independently and together stimulate the release of prolactin from the pituitary. High circulating free fatty acids lead to more serotonin synthesis in the brain, as we described, because they displace tryptophan, and more free tryptophan into the brain leads to higher levels of serotonin synthesis. High prolactin, estrogen, and cortisol all lead to more serotonin production by also directly activating the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase. So high prolactin, cortisol, estrogen, and serotonin will lead to osteoporosis through increased prolactin. And as such, serum prolactin is actually a very good surrogate to measure the stress levels for an organism, and is a very good surrogate for estrogenic activity. And prolactin and cortisol, they have an almost perfect correlation. So even though cortisol has a sort of it varies diurnally in a 24-hour manner from morning to noon to the evening, prolactin is more stable, and the levels of prolactin essentially tell you under how much stress you are or have been historically. So overall, if we can summarize, stress shifts the metabolism away from the oxidation of glucose towards the oxidation of fat, makes you insulin resistant and potentially even diabetic, and inhibits the synthesis of the protective steroids. And as we discussed earlier, chronic inhibition of oxidative metabolism was believed by Warburg to be a direct cause of cancer.
And that's a super interesting fact that you noted, that the paleo community and a lot of health gurus are aware of, that cortisol can directly cause like insulin resistance. but they never go a little bit farther and say like, oh, it's the free fatty acids that are doing that. And so it's always weird for somebody to be promoting like a super low carbohydrate intake and then be talking about stress at the same time and how it's imperative to keep stress under control. And it sounds like their advice and their like understanding of stress is just, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, if you talk to any doctor who's worth his 2 cents or her 2 cents, and almost none of them will deny that if you don't ingest enough glucose will be produced by the body somehow, and usually that happens at the expense of muscle tissue. And the way muscle tissue is converted into glucose is by cortisol rising and taking those amino acids by breaking down the muscle and shuttling them to the liver, and the liver produces glucose. So you do need glucose. If you don't take it, if you don't eat it, your cortisol will rise. And when cortisol rises, you'll lose muscle mass. And when cortisol high, adrenaline will also rise. So you'll make you insulin resistant. In other words, being insulin resistant with low muscle tissue, eventually you end up with a lot of fat and almost no muscle. And that's the least of your problems.
If you wanted to sans supplements, like what would you do to try to increase your own production of the youth steroids to avoid all the complications you just mentioned?
I would say nutrition plays a big role, perhaps the biggest. Lifestyle is another one. But let's talk about nutrition first. Saturated fat and cholesterol are very important because for a number of reasons. First, cholesterol is the raw material for all the steroids. Saturated fat also raises endogenous cholesterol production, and saturated fat inhibits some of the stress signals caused by inefficient metabolism or by high cortisol and adrenaline. I would also ensure adequate protein because proper liver function depends on that. And without proper liver function, you cannot convert the thyroid hormone T4 into the active one, T3. In addition, you should be ingesting plenty of carbohydrates, preferably sugar, because sugar is needed for the synthesis of the thyroid hormone. Vitamin A, as we mentioned before, because it's needed for the proper function of the steroid synthesis enzymes, at least two of them. And of course, avoidance of PUFA, because I think PUFA, as we discussed already, PUFA directly inhibits most of the steroid synthesis enzymes, except the one towards the end of the pathway, such as aromatase and the enzyme 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1. So PUFA directly activates the two enzymes that synthesize cortisol and estrogen. I think this directly shows you that PUFA itself is a stress factor, and avoiding PUFA can probably mitigate the effects of stress to a big degree. PUFA deficient animals, I posted a study on the forum recently. It was shown that PUFA deficient animals synthesize 2 to 3 times more androgens and progesterone compared to animals that are eating the normal diet, which is laden with PUFA, as we all know. Some other things that you can do is if you take caffeine in the doses of a few hundred milligrams per day, that has been shown to increase brain levels of pregnenolone, progesterone, and a progesterone metabolite called allopregnenolone. Allopregnenolone is recently getting a lot of attention by the medical industry because it has been shown to be correlated. Low levels of allopregnenolone have been shown to be correlated with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, especially the suicidal type of depression, as well as several neurodegenerative diseases, specifically dementias like the Alzheimer's disease. Also, it was shown that in adult humans, the biggest factor for declining DHEA levels, and they do decline with age, is in fact insulin resistance. The higher insulin, the lower your levels of DHEA will be, independent of any other factors. So this suggests the restoration of insulin sensitivity will restore the levels of DHEA to their youthful levels, which means you need to maintain insulin sensitivity through the oxidation of glucose versus the oxidation of fat. And there are some supplements that can help you ensure that, such as biotin, niacinamide, which is vitamin B3, thiamine, which is vitamin B1, of course, thyroid hormone. Aspirin is another one. Caffeine is actually a great stimulator of oxidative metabolism. Methylene blue is another supplement which has recently become very, very popular due to it.
Very, very popular.
Yeah, due to its effects on brain oxidative metabolism, which was shown to basically reverse Alzheimer's, regardless of how advanced it was. So these are some of the things you can do to ensure that that endogenous production of the steroids stays normal. Another thing you can do is be exposed to bright light, specifically the red light portion of the spectrum. It has been shown that the modern city lights all over the world, not just the Western world, are actually very heavy in the blue spectrum. And blue light inhibits oxidative metabolism and raises serotonin. Red light leads to increased levels of cytochrome C and also displaces nitric oxide, which has the annoying property to bind with cytochrome C and as such inhibit stage 4 of the oxidative metabolism. So if you expose yourself to red light, you will displace nitric oxide from your mitochondria, and you will allow your cells to perform oxidative metabolism more easily. Ultraviolet light, which is a type of blue light, is directly carcinogenic because it causes the PUFA in your tissues to react with iron. And the only benefit that I see of it is potentially for the synthesis of vitamin D. So if you expose yourself to bright sunlight, which is heavy in the red spectrum, or alternatively to red light, especially at night when the stress hormones are high, this will ensure less generation of stress hormones and more raw material being left to synthesize the protective steroids, such as Pregnenolone, Progesterone DHEA.
When should these hormones be employed to supplement? And then what are some possible expectations somebody should expect when supplementing with pregnenolone, progesterone, or DHEA?
I think we all agree that hypothyroidism and suboptimal metabolism are so prevalent nowadays that I would say anybody over the age of 30 can probably benefit from at least one or maybe even all three of the steroids when you use the supplements. I would personally do some blood tests first because I would, you kind of want to see where you stand on the steroids. The problem with the blood test is that they're not very indicative of the tissue levels of those steroids. So you can have normal levels of progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA in the blood, and most people do, and be really deficient in the tissues, which is where it matters. So some biomarkers that can help you decide whether you're a candidate for supplementation would be, I would say the biggest sign will probably be high cholesterol. So high cholesterol is, to me, is a primary symptom of hypothyroidism. And recently, the American Association of Endocrinologists agreed that high cholesterol is highly indicative of inhibited steroid synthesis. So if you have high cholesterol, which most people over 30 do, this is indicative that you probably have low conversion of cholesterol into the protective steroids. So you could potentially benefit from supplementation. So high cholesterol is one biomarker. Another one would be basically if you test the blood levels of prolactin, this will tell you where you stand. Prolactin is such a good biomarker for stress that it also tells you where you stand on estrogen, cortisol, serotonin, and histamine. And unlike these, go ahead.
Just to chime in, I've never seen anybody that was comfortable with their health with a prolactin over 10.
I would agree. For males, I think Ray recommends below 5. I don't know how realistic that is given how much stress everybody is exposed to, but prolactin is to me, it's a very good biomarker of your overall health. So high cholesterol and suboptimal prolactin are very good signs that you can benefit from some supplementing with these steroids. A word of caution, like I mentioned earlier, is that probably people with the condition Cushing disease or Cushing syndrome, I would advise them to talk to their doctor before supplementing with these steroids, because as far as the progesterone and pregnenolone are concerned, it has not been studied enough for me to say how exactly they will metabolize. In healthy people, pregnenolone converts mostly into progesterone in a ratio of about 50%, and then so if you take 100 milligrams of pregnenolone, you'll get about the equivalent of 50 milligrams of progesterone. And of that, about 30% converts into allopregnanolone. So in healthy people, pregnenolone is a very good precursor of progesterone and some other good brain steroids. DHEA can probably benefit both men and women. However, you should be very careful with the dose because DHEA can both convert into estrogen if used in higher doses and also can activate directly one of the estrogen receptors in tissues, estrogen receptor beta, which has been shown to be associated with poor liver function. So activating that will probably inhibit liver function, and this has been confirmed by most studies using high dose of DHEA. All of them found enlargement of the liver in the animals. So for pregnenolone, the physiological doses are about 40 to 50 milligrams per day. So you can probably start with that, and I would only increase if you don't feel any effect. Some people supplement directly with progesterone, and I think for females that's fine. However, for some males, it may lead to a decrease in libido because progesterone is anti-androgenic. And according to Ray, and I happen to agree, pregnenolone will be a safer supplement for males because it will give you all the progesterone you need without inhibiting your androgens. As far as DHEA is concerned, physiological doses are between 10 and 15 milligrams per day. However, I would not take that much in one sitting because most of it will convert to estrogen. And that fact is not disputed by anybody, neither mainstream medicine nor Ray. So Ray himself says he takes between 2 and 3 milligrams, and that's all he takes daily. Based on the studies that I have seen, up to 15 milligrams per day in humans did not have estrogenic effects. However, just because it can convert so easily to estrogen and because it has direct estrogenic effects itself, I would keep DHEA intake under 15 milligrams per day in divided doses.
And what's the best time, do you think, to take these steroids?
Progesterone happens to be highly sedative for both men and women. So if you're supplementing directly with progesterone, I would take it before going to bed. Pregnenolone, for most people, gives them this sense of mental stimulation, and just for some people even insomnia. So if that's how pregnenolone affects you, I would take it in the morning. And DHEA, if used properly, I would say the only effects that have been consistently observed are increased sense of well-being, higher libido, especially in women, and especially postmenopausal women, better mood, I would say better memory, better brain function in general. So I think DHEA is probably okay to take anytime during the day. I will take pregnenolone in the morning and progesterone at night. And you can combine them, by the way. You can combine pregnenolone with DHEA and pregnenolone and progesterone, or progesterone and DHEA. There was a study done back in the 1980s which showed that pregnenolone greatly amplified the effects of whatever steroid it happens to be co-administered with. So if you take some pregnenolone with DHEA, you likely will be getting the effects of a much larger dose of DHEA without potential side effects.
And the brand is important. And you didn't tell me to do this, and we didn't talk about this, but Idea Labs and like a handful of other companies are really the only companies I personally would trust to take these products, because you can just get, if you just go to the drugstore or whatever and buy something, it's just, you don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah, and most vendors are actually honest by putting on the label what's inside. Some of them are not, and I think that's the biggest concern. But even the ones that are honest and put the stuff that's on the label, some of these things sound fairly benign, but they're really not. Most capsulated supplements containing pregnenolone and DHEA, I'm not aware of a supplement of progesterone that's available over the counter, but most capsulated supplements, pregnenolone and DHEA, contain things like silicon dioxide, some kind of a gum like guar gum, or sometimes even carrageenan. They also contain magnesium stearate. All of these things were being hailed as completely benign for 2 or 3 decades, and only recently there've been a lot of studies showing that every single one of these, and especially them in combination, and particularly silicon dioxide, directly contributes to the pathology of several types of inflammatory bowel disease, such as Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. So unless you have assurance that the supplements you buy are completely pure, I would actually not take them.
I 100% agree. Going back to my experiences with emails, it's not uncommon for people just to be taking kind of like a kitchen sink approach. I always am thinking that might be contributing to the person's problems.
Yeah, I think Ray said, and I've that in many people, including family members, that he has solved more people's problems by telling them to stay away from supplements than by advocating specific nutrition or even avoidance of food. So sometimes it can be that simple. Maybe you're just taking a supplement that irritates you and causes an allergic reaction. And one last point that I wanted to touch upon is that most people probably don't realize, because it's such a normal part of life. Regulating lifestyle is actually very important for the proper synthesis of these steroids. It has been shown that the synthesis of these steroids depends mainly on the levels of serotonin in the brain. So when brain serotonin is low, the blood levels of testosterone, progesterone, and DHEA begin to rise. And serotonin rises very quickly in stress situations, but it also rises in lifestyle that favors routine as opposed to creative exploration. So in other words, people engaged in routine lifestyle will tend to have high serotonin. Unfortunately, for most people in the Western world, their day-to-day activities basically guarantee high serotonin and thus basically low steroid synthesis. In addition, high serotonin promotes cortisol and estrogen, and it contributes to the chronic state of stress as well. Excessive routine, I would say, has been studied as a form of learned helplessness, in other words, depression, because it inactivates the internal guidance system of the organism. And sometimes breaking the routine can lower serotonin and restore proper steroid synthesis. Excessive verbal activity, which is so common nowadays, is actually a form of routine and is typically a sign of high estrogen and serotonin. So, in other words, choosing creative activities that do not involve verbalization may sometimes be routine breaking and lower serotonin. Avoiding authoritarian situations in people, if this is possible at all. I don't know if that is, but it's a big portion. It's a big factor in contributing to the chronic stress. So avoiding authoritarian situations in people is probably one of the main ways to ensure stimulating life and avoid suppressing metabolism. So creative activities have been shown to have dopaminergic effect, and dopamine itself directly lowers serotonin and prolactin, and it has a dramatic effect on steroid production and libido. Dopaminergic drugs like LSD and its derivatives have been used by many artists, musicians, writers, actors, etc., due to dopamine's highly stimulating effect on creativity. In addition, and this is not by accident, dopaminergic drugs are often used in states of hypogonadism, which is low levels of steroid synthesis, because they have been shown to lower serotonin, cortisol, estrogen, and prolactin, and thus increase the levels of testosterone, progesterone, DHEA, and DHT. In other words, routine is equal to means high serotonin, which means low metabolism, which means stress, which means low steroids, except for the stress hormones, estrogen and cortisol. Creativity and freedom, specifically freedom from authoritarianism and freedom to do what your creative personality is driving you to do. So creativity and freedom would mean high dopamine, which means low serotonin, which means high metabolism and ultimately high levels of the protective steroids and low levels of the stress hormones.
To piggyback on that, I was living in a house in San Francisco about 6 months ago, and I lived there for over a year. And one of my roommates got a girlfriend, and she was just at the house all the time. And over time, it created like an insanely stressful situation. And I was trying to change my diet. I was trying to try different supplements, and just nothing could quell the stress, that the tension in the house that had been created. And my ultimate idea was to move. And unfortunately, one of my friends close by had a spot for me to live in, but it was a huge eye opener that, there could be things in your life that are just kind of out of your control. And like you said, freedom and kind of escaping the situation, it might be the best thing to do for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think most people don't realize how much the environment that they live in and the people that they interact with and basically the activities that they perform, how big of an effect it has on their metabolism and their health. I know the popular explanation that it all comes down to genes, but the fact that all of these chronic diseases, specifically cancer, has been increasing in the last 50 years, it tells you that unless some kind of a lethal, obnoxious gene swept through the population in just 50 years, the answer is probably lies in the environment and the lifestyle that you live. And these situations where you basically have a stressful situation that you cannot escape, most people don't know this, but this is a very well-established model of depression in all animal studies. So chronic restraint, inescapable stress lead to the so-called state of learned helplessness, and animals basically give up the fight. In a normal situation, they would normally get over with, and it would not affect them in any way. It can actually kill them depending on how high serotonin is. So situations like that, if you cannot escape, I would say the only thing that can save you is probably some kind of a powerful anti-serotonin drug, but not many people have access to that, and most doctors refuse to prescribe it.
One of my favorite stories Ray, I think, has told at least once or twice is that when a rat is immobilized, it will quickly develop ulcers, but if it's given something to chew on, like a wooden block, it can not develop the ulcers. And he was suggesting that was because the rat could do something about its situation. And that ties in with the whole idea of learned helplessness and people not feeling like they can escape a bad, stressful situation.
Yeah, and official psychiatric practice has recognized this for the last, I would say, at least 50 years. One of the reasons why they advocate people go and see a therapist and talk about their issues is because in situations where you cannot escape stress, talking about it is analogous to the rat biting onto something to relieve some of that inescapable stress. In other words, bottling it up and not venting. In other words, it can put you in a really bad depressive state. And there have been studies done in the former Soviet Union back in the 1960s, where critically ill patients, and some of them terminally ill, when they saw a fellow patient improve, and the best case was when they actually saw the fellow patient get cured, so to speak, some of them managed to overcome their disease, even though it was considered incurable. So it shows you how big of a role serotonin plays in overall metabolism and your overall health. Basically, with high serotonin, you really cannot act and live optimally.
And you mentioned this before, but pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA, these are all serotonin antagonists.
That's correct. Pregnenolone and progesterone, they're both aromatase inhibitors, so they would lower estrogen. Progesterone itself is actually an estrogen receptor antagonist, and in high doses has been shown to actually disintegrate the so-called estrogen receptor in the cell. Recently, progesterone was shown to stop in its tracks terminal breast cancer, which was considered estrogen receptor negative. So, medicine has this idea that, breast cancer, certain types of breast cancer are estrogen driven and others are not. Well, if progesterone helped in this specific case, it shows you that estrogen is still a big role, and there's no such thing as a estrogen negative breast cancer. So basically, pregnenolone and progesterone both inhibit aromatase, and progesterone also inhibits the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, which means it will lower the synthesis of serotonin. DHEA does the same. It inhibits the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, but in low doses only. In high doses, it has been shown to actually enhance the activity of the enzyme, probably due to its conversion to estrogen. So when properly used, these steroids can ensure that you have low levels of the stress hormones, cortisol, estrogen, and low levels of serotonin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Georgi. Where can we find more of your work on the internet this week?
Most of my activities happen on the RAPID forum. I post a lot of studies there, including all of the talking points that we discussed today. The address is www.rapidforum.com, and my username on the forum is Haidut, Haid as in dog, U T as in Tom. You can also send me an email. My email address is again haidut@gmail.com. And also, if you're interested in my supplements, you can go to the website www.idealabsdc.com. And I'll be happy to respond if you contact me by email or send me a message to the forum. And you can also give me a call. My phone number is 202-643-7340.
That concludes this week's episode of Generative Energy. I'd like to thank Georgi for talking with me, and once again my patrons for making this content possible. You can find all of my work on DannyRowdy.com. I have an active Facebook that I post to almost every day, and my Twitter has been less updated. I've been trying not to complicate things there and only post really important stuff. So leave any comments or criticisms, constructive criticisms of the show if you have them. And I think we're going to talk about fat and sugar next week and go for the low-hanging fruit of the low-carb, high-carb world. So you have that to look forward to, and thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you guys soon.